everyone. My name is Malia Lau Kong, and I teach history at Windward Community College. Today's topic is using resources to understand historical context. What exactly is historical context? This is one of the areas that are sometimes really murky, in other words, because historical context refers to the environment in which an action and outcome occur in. So let's go backwards though regarding exactly what does this mean though. So basically things do not happen in a bubble. So an event, for instance, doesn't just take place. There's things around it, the environment, that can help to contribute to that environment in which that event occurs in. So let's look at that. So what's this environment? This environment refers to the conditions that existed at a certain time and place in history. So it's those little details, in other words. And then the next part is exactly what kind of conditions does this refer to? Well, there's all kinds of conditions. There can be political conditions, economic conditions, cultural conditions, social conditions, religious conditions, intellectual conditions, technological conditions. In other words, there's a lot of conditions that take place that makes up this environment in which we consider this to be the historical context. So there's a lot going on, but please don't be overwhelmed. You never need to address every single condition because sometimes those details or those conditions don't matter. So one thing though to be aware of is historical context is not cause. So wait a minute, what does that mean? Okay, so cause is the action that creates an outcome. So in other words, cause and effect. So cause equals action that creates outcome. But cause does not equal historical context. But historical context can influence cause. So you can see if we flip back to slide number 2, where we look at this environment. The historical context is the environment. And in this environment are these conditions that take place. And then now we go back to slide number 3, and we're looking at cause. So the cause of an action, which we can also define as the action being like something that happened in history, takes place within this environment. And thus, the historical context influences cause. But cause itself is separate from the action that causes the outcome. So we'll take a look at this. This is tricky, in other words, but let's look at this part. Historical context is thus the environment in which the cause occurs in. One major thing to understand is that when analyzing historical events, the historical context of such events helps us understand what motivated people to act and behave as they did. So in other words, people don't just all of a sudden decide, I'm going to do this. Essentially, there were a lot of other things that took place prior to that. It's almost like being raised. And we'll see that with specific examples very shortly. Once again, historical events don't happen in a bubble. So for example, the space race did not just happen. Like the United States and the Soviet Union didn't just decide, oh, we're going to see who gets to space first. Instead, there was a whole historical context that surrounded the space race that we call the Cold War. So you cannot ever talk about the space race without addressing the context that we know as the Cold War, in other words. So here, pop the bubble and open up historical events to its environment. Okay, so now let's look at the historical event, because that's really what you're going to be looking at when you do your historical projects for History Day. So what is a historical event? A historical event is a historical event is something that occurred in the past. It can be a specific battle, a war, the election of a new president, a protest march, the invention of a new technology, a speech, and so forth. The historical event may have taken place on a single day or may have unfolded over time, like in the case of a war. For your History Day project, you will need to pick a significant topic that relates to the theme of History Day. The topic that you pick would then contain one or more historical events. So let's practice. So I have this topic, Ashoka. Ashoka is a Maurya emperor from the Maurya dynasty in ancient India. And basically, Ashoka issued a series of rock edicts. So wait, what does that mean? Rock edicts. That means he makes decrees and he has them carved on pillars of rocks. So he's pronouncing it. So you can see this is how he's communicating his edicts. He's having them carved in rocks, in these high pillars, in other words. So the historical event. So let's look at that as a historical event. Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism, his promotion of Buddhism, and his edict proclaimed on pillars. So you can see I threw in a lot of historical events there. And they all kind of affect one another. And in other words, basically, Ashoka, he was someone who was part of the ruling dynasty, the Maurya, and he wanted it all. He wanted to be the sole ruler. And in doing so, what he did was he waged a very bloody civil war with his older brothers until he killed them all. And then he went about conquering because he is truly a warrior king. In the process of conquering, he conquered this place called Kalinga, which was a lucrative trade city. And basically, in doing so, he killed 100,000 people. And then all of a sudden, he felt great remorse. And he realized, wait a minute, bloodshed, this is not good. This is wrong. And in doing so, he says he then adopted Buddhism and he would then rule with what is called kingly dharma. And kingly dharma is like the right conduct for a king. It's like enlightened rule. And so, in other words, once he adopts Buddhism, he converts to Buddhism and he rules with kingly dharma, then he pronounces these rock edicts and it's decrees of like basically taking care of one another. It's like his social welfare policy. And so then it's like, okay, so that's what Ashoka does. Those are these historical events. But what was the environment around that? How do we integrate the historical context into that? So one is political conditions. We cannot talk about Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism without addressing political conditions in the sense that he has a whole rise to power and he takes out his own brothers in order to do so. And then also he conquers Kalinga. So before he decides to become Buddhist and adopt a policy of nonviolence, he's done all of these political things. He's a product of this environment. And then there's also the fact that he lives in ancient India. And ancient India is this complex society where ahimsa or nonviolence is integrated. It's part of the soul there. And so you can see that Ashoka didn't all of a sudden convert to Buddhism because he's like, oh, ahimsa, nonviolence. He was affected, in other words. He went through these things. It was like his pathway. And that's what we mean by historical context. It's like filling in all those little details that if we go back to slide number 3, it says, when analyzing historical events, the historical context of such events help us understand what motivated people to act and behave as they did. So in other words, if we go back to slide number 4, why did Ashoka do this? Why did he convert to Buddhism? Why did all of a sudden nonviolence become such a part of him? And we could look at the huge historical context where India, nonviolence has been for centuries prior to Ashoka, has been one of their fundamental values, in other words. And then even before Ashoka, centuries before, we have the development of Buddhism, which does adopt principles of nonviolence into its religion. So what does this all mean? Historical context helps you understand why someone acted the way they did, communicated the way they did something, or why an event like a war or a battle unfolded. It's like filling in the details, in other words. It's not sense like, okay, if we look at another example, Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we know what happened. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and then the United States went to war. But what is the historical context to that? What leads up to that? And there is a very rich historical context to understand what exactly led up to the actual Japan deciding to bomb Pearl Harbor. So History Day projects need to integrate historical context into their analysis of their chosen topic. In other words, historical context is not something to be treated separately or ignored altogether. So this is a big one. When doing History Day, you want to integrate historical context. It shouldn't just be something separate. It shouldn't be like, oh, here's someone who invented the telephone, but rather than addressing the and then you might say that this person invented this, but without linking it to, say, maybe the Industrial Revolution or the other conditions. You want to do that linkage, in other words. In short, historical context deals with the details that surround a historical event. And these details allow for interpretation and analysis of the historical event. So whatever that historical event is, whether it be the life of a person and what they were known for, or the invention of something, or an actual war or battle, it's the details. And we need to know the details to interpret and analyze something. So right here, I just have some pictures, and these are just basically historical events. And so here's a scene of a battle. And so if we were filling in the historical context for this single event, we will want to start to ask things like, why did these people, this group, and in this case it's the Assyrians, decide that they wanted to besiege this town? What are their motives? What put them here at this time? This basically is a memorial that was set up after the 300 Spartans and some Greek allies lost their lives at the Battle of Thermopylae, defending Greece from the Persian emperor and his invading military. And basically it just memorializes the Spartans, saying, here they lie obedient to their law. And so okay, so if the event is that they gave up their lives at this battle, we need to understand the historical context that led up to them actually being at this battle in which they decided to lay down their life. And so to do that, we need to understand the background, what made the Spartan warriors the Spartan warriors. And there's a whole context in which the Spartan warriors developed this warrior ethos, and their entire city-state is geared towards war. And that took place for at least a century or two prior to these Spartans laying down their lives at the Battle of Thermopylae. And if we just look at a couple more, this is an interesting, I pulled this out because your topic for History Day deals with communication in history. And there's a fascinating event, historical event. In the case, this is the Makaloa protest map. And so basically, well, not this, this is a Hawaiian language newspaper which carried what the Makaloa protest map said. But basically, a woman, she wove the Makaloa protest map to launch her protest about the conditions regarding Hawaiian society in the 19th century. And so this is a way to communicate. In other words, she communicated her protest of this. And so then if we fill in the historical context, it's like, why does she need to protest this? What is occurring, in other words? Likewise, someone that you may have heard of is Martin Luther, who launched the Protestant Reformation. The word Protestant actually has the word protest in it. And so in 1517, he protested against the Catholic Church. But why? Why did he do this? We need to contextualize Martin Luther, in other words. And I would put him in the context of what came decades prior to him, in the sense of the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, all of these things are taking place. Not only are people starting to question what the society in which they live in, they started to want to ask questions like, why is this the way it is? But the Renaissance also had the Catholic popes acting very much so like political leaders. And it seemed that the church, the Catholic Church, was becoming very corrupt. And hence, Martin Luther grows up in this environment where people more and more see the church as corrupt and the popes are not basically practicing what they preach and such. So hence 1517 comes along. Martin Luther, though, when he does his protest, he's not the first person to protest the Catholic Church. In this case, he was protesting the sale of indulgences. But people prior to him, decades prior, say in the 1400s, they were protesting also. It was just that in the 1400s, when people launched the protest of the Catholic Church, they may have lost their lives in doing so. They were silenced. But 1517 comes along, Martin Luther writes his 95 Theses, and rather than him being silenced, his 95 Theses take on a whole new life because of a technological context that was part of the environment, and that's the printing press. His words can live on because of this printing press, in other words. So that is a very rich area to explore. Moving on to slide number 7. Please note, we use resources to understand historical context. Historical context, it's very hard to just be like, oh, here's the historical context. You actually need to do some reading, some research to do so. So I always say secondary sources. Secondary sources are a great place to start in order to understand historical context. And probably one of the best places is just picking up a textbook. If you have access to a world history textbook or whatever specific area you're looking at, take a look at what's going on, in other words, because textbooks do a really great job in filling in the historical context. And then from there, then you can look at, it'll give you an avenue into understanding primary sources. And so primary sources are like the most important thing because every historian needs their evidence and it comes to us in the form of primary sources. For primary sources, when finding evidence for what the historical context was, primary sources are the most important place to look. However, primary sources can be elusive and hard to interpret. Hence, it is best to start with secondary sources, which can help point out what evidence one should be looking for in primary sources. So it also can help you understand the primary source because, for instance, what if the primary source was just, if we go back to slide number 5, this memorial to the Spartans where it says, here lies the Spartans obedient to their laws, they died, something like that. So what does that mean? We have no idea other than the fact that, okay, they died and they were obedient to their laws. Well, so if this is the primary source, then we need to fill in the historical context. So that's where, if we go back to slide number 7, secondary sources that tell you about what Spartan society was like is very, very helpful. Okay, but here's a caution. Caution, when researching a topic on the internet, be aware that the information you find could be missing historical context. Depending on the site in which you find the information on, you could be finding a wealth of information about the specific historical event itself, but not about the environment in which the action and outcome of the historical event occurred in. So in other words, the details that surround the historical event could be missing. And if the details are missing, then interpretation and analysis are not possible. So just be aware that these things, these historical events, they don't happen in a bubble. You need to pop the bubble, see what's going on, see what was the details around something. And sometimes Google searches on the internet will tell you exactly, here, Battle of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans died here, but they will not tell you at all the fact that Sparta, to have the elite warriors we had in 480 BCE, Sparta went through centuries of getting to that point. In other words, they had a whole military machine that took a very long time to cultivate. So this is where historical context fills in the details. And last slide, slide number 8. What I want you to take away, though, from everything is just have fun during your History Day project. In other words, pick a topic that fascinates you and don't forget to include the details that surround your chosen historical event. Thank you.